am hugely terrific, you bet, Paul.
A warm welcome to you all. Our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. And today we'll be talking about a wider range of issues. But let's start with maybe what a lot of people don't talk about, but the politics of ethnicity. When we talk about politics, a lot of people try to look at the tribe or the region where they come from when they are campaigning in terms of politics, especially African politics. How significant is that politics when people try to maybe rally people around them from the same tribe or from the same region?
First of all, Paul, there is really nothing particularly wrong in identifying and being loyal to your ethnic roots. That is almost a normal thing, and I think it is not in fact limited to Africa. It is something that is rather universal. In other societies, it might be interpreted into political parties, into professional organizations, for example, into labor or trade unions and all that kind of stuff. The only problem is that when you actually come to a point that you become too sycophantic, too really sycophantic to such an extent that you get blinded by the fact that you belong to a particular community, and you take advantage of that particular community at the expense of other equally important social communities. In other words, you should feel free really to celebrate the community that you belong to, but you should also make sure that you do not use it at the expense of other communities who happen to be in the same space, who happen to be competing for the same resources and all that kind of stuff. Usually, it's not simply that people really like to be associated with their ethnic community or what you call tribe. It is simply because they think and expect to benefit, to gain from that kind of association, especially when it comes to the distribution of resources and opportunities.
Is it something that unites people, or it's more of something that divides people? Because when you look at a lot of our communities in Africa, we tend really to sort of like support our own, and in most cases, it doesn't help to build the country. In some cases, it has actually contributed to ethnic killings. For example, the genocide in Rwanda. It was based along ethnic lines, and you've seen clashes in northern Nigeria. You've seen clashes in Congo, and even in some other countries where it hasn't gotten to a full-blown conflict, but there's tension there.
You remember when we were in the Zambian capital, Lusaka, paying a courtesy call on the Zambian founding president, Dr. David Kenneth Kaunda. You remember when I told him that one of the reasons that attracted me to him and his colleagues, such as Tanzanian founding president Julius Kambarage Nyerere and Ghanaian founding president the Osajifo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and people like Kano Gamara Abdel of Egypt and Ben Bella of Liberia and what have you, of Algeria and what have you, was simply because in them I saw individuals who neither had boundaries or borders in terms of how they perceived Africa. For them, it was Africa. And that is how they focused their strength on. And so they were able, in otherwise, people, leaders who were able to focus on the forest as opposed to the trees, because the trees necessarily going to fall, but the forest remains.
Shaka, you make a very good point there. You talk about how these founding fathers never looked at ethnicity as an issue. Instead, they looked at Africa as a whole. But surprisingly, more recently, all younger politicians tend to use ethnicity as something that can rally their base. I mean, we've even seen it here in the United States where President Donald Trump used rallies, his supporters using a race. Isn't that something almost similar to what these young politicians are doing back home in Africa?
Mind you, at the outset, I told you that this business of ethnicity is not limited to Africa. It is a phenomenon that is global, except that in some countries, in some cultures and what have you, it assumes different names. These are basic social, economic, political organizations. Sometimes they can be called in some countries pressure groups. Sometimes they can be called, interest groups, which are essentially groups that come together in the process of trying to compete for resources which often happen to be limited, and therefore there has to be competition. And so when you have elections, for example, in the United States, you obviously hear about the importance, for example, of the Irish Catholic vote.
Right.
You hear the significance of the black vote. You hear the significance of the women's vote. All these are sort of, in a way, communities really, so to speak. But they have to get a bit, a slice of the pie.
Right.
And in order for them to get or to be ready to compete for a slice of the pie, they have to be able to mobilize and organize so that they can speak with one voice. And in this particular case, what I think that Africa, again, African leaders need to do, they should not again look at their ethnic communities in order to use them at the expense of the other ethnic communities, because all these different communities together, they form what is called a nation state. And therefore, if they are going to look at the resources and opportunities that they create, they should look for a criteria that is common to all the different communities, so that when they come to the situation where they have to, in a sense, divide or allocate resources and what have you, no one is left behind.
Yeah, Shaka, how do you respond to Yusuf Farah? Good evening, sir. My question is, when you hear Africa, you hear wars, you hear conflict, you hear military coups. So what is the root cause? What is the root cause of these conflicts? So what is the root cause of these coups? Especially because a lot of people tend to use, again, what we are talking about as a basis maybe to launch coups, to launch these ethnic riots that spill over.
Paul, it is about resources stupid. At the end of the day, politics, as it is the power to be in a situation where you can actually decide who gets what, when, where, and why. And so it's about resources. You get coups because there are people who feel that they have been shortchanged. And so they mobilize around a gun, around uniform, and what have you. And when they seize power, the first thing they do really is, for example, to divide senior or important government positions. And what do these positions do? These positions give them unfettered access to goods and services, resources. People want to eat meat, man. And in order for them to eat meat, they have to have money. In order for them to have money, they probably have to occupy certain specific positions. And then they create what you call political patronage by essentially favoring or essentially discriminating in favor of people either who they are related to by blood, marriage, or ideology, or religion, or other sort of criteria. In other words, it's about connections. It's about connections. You have a few jobs that are being competed for by a lot of people. So it's only a few people that can really have those jobs. So how are you going, in fact, to end up choosing who actually gets what?
That's interesting. Let's maybe go to another comment. Let's go to Emmanuel Exit Shaka. As a seasoned journalist and political pundit, how can we hold politicians accountable?
Well, first of all, we need to mobilize and organize so that we can speak with one voice. And we need to embrace democracy. We need to embrace democracy because whether we like it or not, at least so far, it is a system that at least we know that works. I know that there are people who look at other different types of systems and what have you, and they have a very good, point for that. But it was at one time a great British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who actually once said that democracy, in his view, was in fact the worst form of government, except for the other systems that we know. And the good thing about democracy is because, frankly, it is an equal opportunity employer because it is premised, for example, on the pillars of social, economic, political justice for all. It also is a system that is based, for example, on the idea of a leader being accountable, accounting to the people that in fact vote for him or elect her or choose that particular individual to occupy a certain office. And so each time, at least periodically, that particular individual, in order to justify continued occupation of that particular office, has to be able to get into the business which they call accountability. Accountability is very, very important because at the end of the day, it tells you that you are not the boss. The people actually who are your boss are essentially the people. The people who chose you, whether through an election or whether they basically looked at you, compared and contrasted you with the others who are in competition and decided that at the end of the day, you probably, in their view, you have the character, you have the integrity, you have what it takes to be their leader, and they are willing to follow you. But they can only do so if periodically you go back to them, consult them, and report to them how you are doing your thing.
Let's go to a commenter from South Sudan. Let's go to Mayen. Ndugu Shaka, how do we reverse the clock back to tranquility where we have, after politicians have ignited dormant ethnic fault lines leading to deadly civil wars like what we see in South Sudan?
You know, it is very unfortunate to tell you the truth when we talk about South Sudan, because South Sudan happens to have the distinction of being composed of people who fought for decades against the social injustice that was meted at them by the people who they characterized as Arabs. They reached a point where they eventually were listened to by the region, by the continent, and by the international community. They negotiated a deal whereby if they chose to be independent, they will be independent so long as they expressed that wish through a referendum, which they did, and overwhelmingly chose to live on their own. And mind you, the part of Sudan that they occupy, Paul, I've been there a couple of times. It's one of the most fertile part of Africa. Mm-hmm. This is a place which could actually be the bread basket, not only of the region, but probably even the Middle East. Then it is also very lucky in the sense that it has oil. It has a lot of resources. What it does not have, in fact, are people. It should get into the business of a positive immigration policy, of actually seeking out Africans to come and help them develop their country. But unfortunately, they are preoccupied with killing one another. It's very unfortunate.
Yeah, Shaka, let's switch the topic a little bit. Let's talk to something that is dear to your heart. From the time I've known you, you've always talked about education, having quality education, emphasizing quality education. And in your particular case, to both, you've gone all the way to the top. You have a PhD. But there are a lot of people in your footsteps back in Africa, on the continent, who have gone to school. Their parents pay so much money to put them in these schools, but they can't find a job after they graduate. You just shared with me a video that was, just watching it, I started like tearing up because this is a guy who, by any measure or standard, is arguably one of the smartest kids. His video happened to be going viral right now. He graduated on top of his class, but he can't find a job. Why should African parents emphasize education and their kids can't get jobs?
Education, of course, is very important under any circumstances. The only problem is, what type of education are we talking about? We should be talking about quality education. And what is quality education? It should be the type of education, first of all, that reflects the socio-economic, political, cultural realities of where that particular individual comes from. You should be able to learn certain things that you are going to get an opportunity to practice. And if you put them in practice, that you are going to have an opportunity to make some contributions to society. And society in turn is going to be paying you for your contributions so that you can put food on the table, so that you can you can actually pay for your bills and all that kind of stuff. The type of education that we have across most of Africa is, for the most part, even though most African countries got political independence, it actually turns out that this type of independence is probably political flag independence, national anthem type of independence. When it comes to education, for example, the curriculum did not change. For the most part, students continue learning more about the same things the way I actually did. And this was in the 50s, in the 60s, and all that kind of stuff. And so I think what we need now, I think that governments should actually look at it as some of the most urgent things to do to bring the type of education that can not only be some kind of opportunity to take students really through the motions of speaking foreign languages. Sometimes you'll find that in former English-speaking countries or former French-speaking countries or colonies and what have you, some of these students probably even speak better French than the Frenchmen and the French women themselves in Paris or Toulouse. Some of these guys in former British colonies, whether they were called territories or called protectorates, sometimes they speak much better English than the Englishman downtown London. And so I think what is really needed and really required, what I would say is the fierce urgency of now, is making sure that you design a curriculum that reflects the social, economic, political, cultural realities of your country. You look at the needs of your people so that people are going to learn the type of things that they are going to have the opportunity to practice by making contributions to their societies. For example, education should simply, it should not simply be this business of saying, my son or my daughter must have a university degree. But what is that kind of university degree worth? Is it worth something, or is it worth anything? You should also, give people opportunities to learn to use their hands, for example.
Technical education.
Technical education. And make sure that those people who actually gain the type of technical education you provide are also respected in society. Just like it is done, for example, in Singapore. Just like it is done in Germany. It is done in Canada.
Here,
and
right
what
here.
have you. Here, yes, but probably not much, because here again, it is still very much academic. You get BAs, Bachelor of Science degrees, you get master's degrees, PhDs, and what have you. Yeah, in some situations, yes. But we should have a situation where somebody learns a skill set. This skill set is going to be sold to society. And in return, society is going to compensate this particular individual who is making a contribution to the well-being of the community.
Shaka, a quick follow-up. Should a person like Kevin Ochenga, who can't find a job, blame the education system or blame his government, or what is it? And how can his story, for example, maybe help to change the way things look on the continent?
First of all, we are talking about Kevin Ochenga, a guy that we actually watched in a video, a great job, by the way, which was done by our Kenyan affiliate television station, Citizen, a man who got a first-class degree from the University of Nairobi, and yet cannot even buy himself a meal.
Yeah. He's on the streets.
A guy who was told by society, by the elders, by the culture, by the government, that if you can be a nice guy, you have discipline, you behave, you read very hard, you pass your exams, you go to university and get a degree, you will have made it. It is very unfortunate because it is a sort of educational nightmare. This guy has gotten nothing out of what he was told if he could actually follow, and he could be that disciplined and focused, and he could focus like a laser beam, which he did, because what else can you get if you can get a first-class degree at the University of Nairobi or any university for that matter?
And in sciences.
And actual sciences, he should be working, for example, in banks, He should be working for insurance companies and what have you. These are guys who are supposed to be knowing mathematics and what have you. They should be able to work 24/7. But this guy has absolutely no job. But then again, it is good that he has actually woken up to such an extent that he is becoming an entrepreneur of sorts. He is, he's, for example, washing women's hairs and all kind of stuff, earning a living out of that. He's making some mandazi, and I like mandazi. Next time I go to Nairobi, I look for him and buy his mandazi.
Yeah.
So he's trying. So I think that, in fact, what the governments need to do, they need to promote these types of, trainings like entrepreneurship, so that people can get the idea of how they can actually not only work, but perhaps, in fact, put together a company or something that will create jobs so that they can, in fact, employ other people.
We are almost running out of time. Tomorrow, what are you talking about on Straight Talk Africa?
We are talking about the sad state of child marriages. Girls that are married when, in fact, they are not ready really to do anything. They are not ready to, for example, have a family, and they are being married because sometimes their parents can't feed them. Sometimes their parents want to have dowry. Sometimes their parents want to make connections. Sometimes their parents want to have influence. You can't blame them. But at the end of the day, it is at the expense of this young girl who becomes a bride at a time when she is not really ready to do that.
We have time for another quicker comment. Let's go to Musanga Sayed in Tanzania. I'm a professional journalist and I don't need to work in a TV or radio or newspaper to earn a living, but I can start an association where I can earn money. Your quick reaction to that?
I don't understand the question.
It's talking about how people should look out for different forms of employment just to stay alive instead of waiting for that former employment.
Yeah, and people do. There are a lot of people in Africa, even here where we are, who at the end of the day may have studied one thing, but in fact when it comes to a career, they end up doing something else. I think that that would be the right thing to do. As a matter of fact, I often advise people that what is important sincerely is knowing what your passion is. And as I often say, all of life is about passion, is about action and reaction. And to ignore the passion, action and reaction of your generation is to risk having not really lived at all, occupying space.
On that note, I thank you so much. We've run out of time. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington.
You're most welcome.
But no, I think, I feel very strongly about this, and I think that, in fact, one of my biggest worries for this country, domestically, is that so many newspapers in medium and small towns are closing Well, who's going to keep an eye on the mayor or the town council or the people that are doing the contracting for the town?